The saloon doors creaked as they swung open, spilling a slice of late afternoon sun across the smoke-hazed room. Into that golden shaft stepped a man so broad he seemed to fill the whole doorway. His shoulders brushed the frame, his shadow swallowing up the piano in the corner. The music faltered mid-note. A hush dropped like a heavy quilt. Every head turned. Cards stilled on the tables, dice frozen mid-cast, mugs of whiskey hovering inches from lips. Men shifted in their chairs, boots scraping across the warped floorboards. The barkeep's hand polishing a glass, he slowed and stopped. A cough from the back corner cracked the silence, only to be smothered instantly. The stranger took one step in, and the boards groaned under his weight. Another step, heavier than the last, boots striking like hammers on an anvil. He didn't glance left or right, though he could feel their eyes crawling over him, measuring, distrusting, judging. He'd felt it before. Too many towns, too many saloons, all the same. Suspicion sharp as knives. He wore a battered hat low over his brow, brim shadowing the hard lines of his face. A beard streaked with gray covered his jaw, and across one cheek ran the faint trace of a scar. Old, faded, but never forgotten. His coat was long and weathered, the kind a man might wear across endless miles of open country. Dust clung to him, dust that told of distance traveled and nights slept under indifferent stars. No one greeted him. No one offered a nod or a seat. Instead, a quiet fear rippled through the room, unspoken but heavy in the air. He felt it pressing against his chest, the same way he had felt the weight of cannon smoke years ago, the same way he had felt the emptiness after battle. His throat was dry, but he did not ask for a drink. His belly was hollow, but he did not ask for food. The truth was simpler. He had grown weary of rejection, weary of walking into rooms that turned cold the moment his shadow fell across the threshold. So he turned, slow and deliberate, as if the weight of his own body fought against him. The boards creaked when as he left, pushing back into the light. Outside, the prairie wind caught his coat and tugged at his hat brim. Dust swirled around his boots, rising from the sun-baked street, like ghosts stirred from shallow graves. He walked down the center of town, where horses stamped and wagons rattled. But no one called his joy. Mothers ushered children inside. Shopkeepers pretended to busy themselves with shutters and signs. Each step echoed louder for the silence that followed. He walked as a man walks, when he carries not just his own body, but the burden of stories whispered behind his back. To them he was a giant, a storm in flesh, a reminder of blood and ruin. To himself, he was simply mountain, a man without welcome, drifting from one dusty street to the next, searching for something he no longer had a word for. The sun dipped lower, painting his long shadow across the dirt. And once, again, he was alone. Whispers always found him before he reached the end of any street. They traveled faster than his boots could carry him, faster than a horse could gallop. A stranger might see a tall, quiet man with a tired look in his eyes, but the townsfolk saw only the shadows of the stories clinging to him. Some swore he'd split a man in half with his bare hands during a brawl down by the border. Others said he carried ghosts from the war, Yankee or rebel. No one seemed to know for sure, but all agreed he had left rivers of blood in his wake. They spoke of rages that came sudden as prairie fire, of fists that crushed bone, of a temper that never cooled once it was lit. The details blurred, shifting from one retelling to the next. But the picture they painted never changed. Mountain was a danger. Shopkeepers closed shutters when he passed. Horses snorted and pulled their reins taut, as if they too sensed something unsettled about the giant. Women drew their children indoors with quick, jerking motions, muttering about bad luck and wicked men. Even the dogs kept their distance, hackles raised but silent. Mountain said nothing. He never did. His silence was misread as menace, but in truth it was all he had left. Words had never saved him before. Steel and powder had spoken louder in his life than any oath or promise. So he walked with his head bowed, hat brim casting his face in shadow, shoulders stooped under more than just the weight of his coat. The only sound he carried was the heavy clink of the gun at his hip, an old revolver worn smooth at the grip. Folks assumed it was his companion, his weapon of choice. But he knew better. The true weight dragging at him wasn't iron or powder. It was memory. The sharp crack of musket fire still rang in his ears some nights. He could still smell the acrid sting of black powder, the copper tang of blood in the mud. He could still see faces, young men torn apart by cannon shot, comrades gone in the smoke. He walked past a blacksmith's shop, the clang of hammer on iron, halting for just a moment, as the smith glanced up, then quickly bent back to work. The sound resumed, ringing out into the dust-filled air. But Mountain felt the pause like a blade against his neck. Every pause, every silence, reminded him he didn't belong. The town had no use for him. No saloon wanted him at their bar. No ranch needed his strength. No church offered him a bench to kneel upon. His reputation was the only introduction he ever got, and it closed every door before he could lift a hand to knock. And yet, he kept moving, always forward, never rooted, like a tumbleweed too heavy to roll, but too stubborn to stop. Behind him, the whispers followed, low, sharp, and merciless. Ahead of him, there was only more dust, more eyes that would never soften. Mountain knew it well. A man without welcome has no home, only roads. The afternoon heat pressed heavy on the town. A shimmering haze rising from the dirt road. Mountain moved slow, as he always did, his long stride deliberate, the kind of pace that didn't invite conversation. His shadow stretched long ahead of him, dark against the pale dust. Near the general store, the street seemed empty. Folks had already scattered inside when they saw him coming. The porch chairs stood abandoned, cards left mid-game on a barrel top. Only the buzz of a fly and the creak of a sign in the wind filled the silence. Then he noticed her, a small figure, no taller than the hitching post, barefoot on the sun-bleached boards of the porch. A girl, maybe 10, with tangled dark hair that caught the light like threads of coal. She stood where the others had fled, her hands hanging loose at her sides, her eyes fixed steady on the giant who filled the road. Mountain slowed, his boots dragging faint grooves in the dirt. He wasn't used to eyes that held on him, without fear. Most folks looked quick and then away, spitting to the side or more muttering under their breath. But this child's gaze lingered, unflinching, curious. Her eyes were wide and dark, like pools of creek water in shadow. And though her face was young, there was something knowing in the way she studied him. It wasn't boldness, not quite. It was more like she was measuring him, wondering what lay beneath the scarred hands and the towering frame. Mountain felt an unease crawl up his spine. He had stared down gun barrels, faced men screaming with bloodlust. Yet the steady regard of this barefoot girl unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat, and after a pause that felt heavier than a gunfight, he touched the brim of his hat in an awkward, halting gesture. The motion surprised even him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd tipped his hat to any. The girl didn't smile, didn't shy away. She only gave a small, solemn nod, as though she had just confirmed something to herself. Then she stayed still, watching. As he passed by, Mountain walked on, his back prickling with the strange heat of her stare. But his steps felt different, lighter, though the weight on his belt and shoulders hadn't changed. For once, the silence around him wasn't filled with suspicion. It was filled with something else. At the far end of the street, he glanced back. She was still there, small as a sparrow on that porch, her bare feet pressed against the boards, eyes following him until the dust swallowed him whole. Mountain pulled his hat lower, hiding a face that had softened, just a little. He didn't know her name yet. He only knew this. In a town full of cold stares, one pair of eyes had met his without flinching. And for reasons he could not put to words, it mattered. The next evening, Mountain sat on the steps of an abandoned shack at the edge of town. The sky burned red as the sun dipped behind the far hills, and the prairie wind carried dust across his boots. He sat there often, on the outskirts, where no one minded his presence, where the stares of townsfolk couldn't reach. His stomach was hollow, the kind of hunger he'd learned to live with. A man who wasn't welcome rarely found a steady meal. He heard the scuff of small feet before he saw her. The girl. Same tangled hair, same bare feet, same steady eyes. She stood a few paces off, clutching something in both hands. Without a word, she stepped closer and held it out. A chunk of bread, rough and hard around the edges. Not much, but it was food. Mountain blinked down at it, then at her. "You sure about that?" His voice was gravel, low from disuse. She didn't answer, just kept her hand out, eyes fixed on him. Slowly, as if afraid the bread might vanish, he reached and took it. His fingers, scarred and calloused, dwarfed hers. For a moment their hands brushed, and she didn't flinch. He muttered, "Thank you," the words sounding strange in his own mouth. She sat down beside him on the step, knees drawn up, arms looped around them. No questions, no chatter. Just a small presence in the fading light. Mountain tore the bread in half and offered her a piece, but she shook her head. So he ate, quiet, while the town went on about its business. Wagon wheels rattled over the ruts, dogs barked down some alley, a man cursed at his mule. Yet here on the edge of town, it felt different. The noise of life moved past them, but it didn't touch the silence they shared. Mountain chewed slow, thinking. He was used to silence that cut, silence sharp with judgment. This wasn't that. This silence had weight, but not the kind that pressed him down. It was simply unburdened. Like the girl herself, she didn't ask him for serious. She didn't ask what scars meant, or where he came from. She didn't demand he prove anything. She just sat there, small and still, as if his company wasn't something to be feared. For the first time in longer than he could recall, Mountain didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel like a shadow moving through towns that wanted him gone. He felt seen in a quiet way by someone who asked nothing in return. When the last bite of bread was gone, the girl rose, brushed the dust from her knees, and slipped away without a word. Mountain watched her go, the sound of her small footsteps fading into the night. He leaned back against the wooden step, the sky now streaked with purple, and let out a long breath. Something had shifted, something small, but undeniable. He was still alone, but for that brief hour, with a crust of bread and a child's silent company, the loneliness had loosened its grip. By midday, the town baked beneath a punishing sun. The air shimmered above the dirt street, and every breath tasted of dust. Mountain sat outside the livery stable, broad back bent as he worked on a worn saddle. His scarred hands moved slow, but sure, threading coarse twine through cracked leather, pulling each stitch tight with practiced strength. The rhythm of his work steadied him, as though every knot bound up a piece of his restless mind. A shadow fell across his boots. He didn't look up right away. He didn't have to. He already knew who it was. Penny. She crouched near him, resting her chin on her knees, eyes following the sweep of his hands, as if each motion were a secret worth learning. He let her sit there, silent, until her curiosity broke loose. "Why are your hands cut up like that?" she asked, voice small but clear. Mountain paused mid-stitch. The scars ran like rivers across his palms, ridges of old burns and knife marks, souvenirs from too many years spent in violence. He flexed his fingers, the leather creaking under his grip. "Work," he said finally, the word rough, "and fighting I should have left behind." She didn't flinch, just tilted her head, studying the lines of his hands as though they were maps. "Does being tall mean you can see farther than other folks?" Mountain snorted, the closest thing to a laugh he'd managed in weeks. "No, same view as anyone else. Just get more sun in the eyes." Penny grinned at that, but her questions didn't stop. They came one after the other, bright as pebbles tossed into a still pond. Was the war louder than a thunderstorm? His jaw tightened. He remembered the roar of cannon fire shaking the earth, the shriek of bullets snapping past his ears, the cries of men torn apart in mud. Louder than any storm God ever sent. He tied off the stitch, voice low. "Yeah, louder." She nodded as if she had expected that answer, her small face solemn. Then she asked the one that pierced deepest. "Do the people you loved, the ones that died, do they still think of you? In heaven?" The question hit him harder than any fist. Mountain froze, thread clutched tight in his fist, breath heavy in his chest. He stared past her, out toward the horizon, where the land stretched empty, endless. For a long time he said nothing. At last he muttered, voice hoarse, "I surely hope so." the words scraped out of him like stones dragged across the ground. Penny didn't press. She just gave a small nod, eyes deep with an understanding beyond her years. It was as if she carried the answer for him, holding a piece of hope he could not bear to lift himself. Mountain bent back over the saddle, hands steady again, but his mind far away. The girl's questions lingered in the hot air, heavier than the sun overhead, heavier than any burden he carried on his back. And for the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him that wasn't just survival. It didn't take long for folks to notice the girl's quiet company with the outcast. A child didn't keep secrets well, not in a place where every curtain twitched at the smallest stir. Soon whispers spread faster than prairie fire in August. Some said the giant had bewitched her, that no decent child would sit so close to a man like him unless picked. Others claimed it was only a matter of time before something terrible happened, that a brute who had killed men on battlefields would sooner or later turn his violence on anyone foolish enough to trust him. Mountain heard their mutters whenever he walked the street. A shopkeeper who once nodded stiffly now slammed his shutters as Mountain passed. The barber, who might have welcomed his coin, muttered loud enough for others to hear, "Best keep young ones clear of that devil. He'll ruin her." Sure as the sun rises, women pulled their children away when Penny strayed too close. One mother even hissed, "You stay away from that man, you hear? He's got nothing but trouble hanging on him." She tugged her boy by the arm so hard he stumbled. Penny, small and defiant, didn't listen. She kept turning up where Mountain sat, whether on the steps of the livery or near the edge of town by the dry well. She'd bring him scraps, a bruised apple, a heel of bread, once even a strip of jerky she admitted stealing from her own kitchen. Mountain tried to refuse, but the girl's stubborn stare left him no choice. He never touched her hand when she gave him food, never reached for her, never pulled her close. All he did was tip his hat and murmur thanks, as if afraid the smallest gesture might be twisted into something foul by the eyes forever watching. Yet the stares grew colder, the whispers sharper. The townsfolk's dislike of Mountain hardened into something meaner. No one offered him day work anymore. No fences to mend, no cattle to drive, no stables to muck out. Men who once might have hired him now muttered about protecting their families. And though he said nothing, Mountain felt the weight of their suspicion settling heavier each day. Still, he bore it. He could have raised his voice, could have let his temper loose like in the old days, but he swallowed the fire. Better to carry the scorn himself than to drive Penny away. So he sat quiet when she came, letting her talk, letting her silence fill the space. The girl was the only thing in that town that reminded him he wasn't invisible. And if he had to take the cold eyes of every tool in the county just to keep that small scrap of human kindness, then he would. The town didn't know it, but the giant was holding back storms for their sake. The trouble began with a scream. It was Widow Cordelia, her voice sharp enough to cut through the hammering sun. Folks came running, spilling out of stores and houses, circling her small clapboard home on the edge of town. She stood on her porch, gray hair wild, apron twisted in her fists. My deed, she cried. My land papers are gone, stolen clean from my chest. Her voice cracked, desperate. That piece of paper was all she had. The law's only promise that her little patch of earth was hers and her boys', safe from men who circled like vultures. Without it, she was nothing but another woman, waiting to be driven out. The crowd buzzed, uneasy. Then, like smoke curling upward, suspicion found its shape. Heads turned, and whispers hissed. It's him. Who else would it be? Big as an ox, never works a day, always skulking. Man like that don't eat unless he steals it. Eyes fell on Mountain before he even arrived. He walked slow into the crowd, drawn by the noise, unaware the trap had already closed around him. When the townsfolk parted, it wasn't with welcome. It was with fear and accusation. Sheriff Webb stepped forward, short and wiry, his badge catching the sun. He looked relieved to have the crowd at his back, his voice louder than his frame could carry. Mountain, he barked, that deed's gone, and you're the only drifter here without an alibi. Mountain's jaw set. His deep voice carried steady, unshaken. I didn't take it. But words meant nothing. Suspicion was already branded into him. Men muttered agreement. Women shook their heads. In the eyes of the town, guilt clung to him like dust to boots. Penny pushed through the legs of grown folk, her small voice trembling but fierce. He didn't do it. I saw somebody else by Widow Cordelia's porch last night. A man in a gray coat. A ripple went through the crowd, but it was swallowed by louder voice. She's a child. What does she know? Don't let him fool you through the girl. The sheriff raised his hand for silence. You'll be gone by sundown, Mountain. I won't say it twice. If you're still here come dark, we'll deal with you our way. The meaning was clear, as the rifle barrels glinting in the crowd. Mountain looked down at Penny, her eyes wide, her fists balled at her sides. He wanted to tell her not to cry, but the words stuck. Instead, he turned away. His shoulders bowed under the weight of another false charge. The sun burned hot on his back as he walked out of the circle. Behind him, voices rose, sharp and certain. The town had found its scapegoat. And Mountain knew once again, the truth didn't matter. By the time the sun sank low, the town had settled on its verdict. Mountain was guilty, whether or not the truth agreed. Men leaned against posts with rifles in their arms, muttering that justice was best served quick. Women whispered behind curtains, nodding to each other as if they'd seen this end coming all along. Mountain sat alone near the livery, back against a rough-cut post, watching the last streaks of daylight fade. He'd been cast out before, run down roads where no one wanted him. This felt no different. His hand rested on the revolver at his hip, not in threat, but in habit. The same way a soldier rests his palm against a scar he'll never heal. Then came the sound of small feet scuffing over the dirt. Penny stood before him, her face boiled from the dust and heat, her chin set stubborn, her eyes burned bright, the only fire in a town that had already given its judgment. You can't leave, she said, voice breaking, though she forced it strong. If you go, they win. And you didn't do it. Mountain let out a slow breath, gaze lowering. Little one, you don't know how this works. Truth doesn't matter to folks who already chose their story. I've seen it before. Seen men hang without a trial. Seen towns sweep their guilt under another man's shadow. I don't care, Penny snapped, stamping her bare foot. I saw him, the one in the gray coat. Not you. I'll prove it. Her words cut sharper than the sheriff's threats. Mountain looked at her. Really looked. She was trembling, fear tightening her fists, yet her eyes held steady. That fire wasn't just defiance, it was belief. Belief in him, a man no one else in the county would claim. You'll get yourself hurt, he muttered. She shook her head hard. Not if you help me. He stared into the gathering dark, remembering the weight of battlefields, the stink of gunpowder, the look of men marching toward death, with no hope but orders. He had sworn he'd never carry that burden again. But here was a child, small and fragile, daring him to stand, not for himself, but for the truth. Something long buried stirred inside him. An ember, faint but stubborn, refusing to die. At last Mountain stood, his great frame blocking the last light of day. All right, he said quietly. We'll look. But you stay close, and you listen sharp. If trouble comes, you run. Penny nodded so fast her hair whipped around her face. Together they moved through the night, eyes searching for signs the town refused to see. In the dirt by Cordelia's porch, Mountain found boot prints too narrow for his size. Along the fence, a scrap of gray cloth snagged on a rusty nail fluttered in the wind. Penny snatched it up, holding it like proof forged in iron. Mountain saw her small hand clutching that fabric, saw the fierce light in her eyes. For the first time in years he felt it, the will to fight, not for his own survival, but for something honest. The giant had endured long enough. Now, with a child's conviction beside him, he meant to stand. The town slept light, but shadows moved easy after midnight. Mountain and Penny slipped quiet along the back alleys, the girl keeping to his heel, clutching that scrap of gray cloth like it was gold. Dogs barked once, then fell silent, as if even they knew not to tangle with the man drifting through the dark. Mountain's boots pressed into the dirt behind the sheriff's office. He'd spent enough years in camps and barracks to know where men hid their secrets. Webb wasn't clever, just greedy. And greedy men always tucked their spoils close. He jimmied the back latch with the edge of his knife, easing the door open without a sound. Inside, the air was thick with stale whiskey and cigar smoke. A lamp burned low on the desk, left by a hand too sure of its power to bother snuffing it out. Mountain's eyes swept the room, hard and steady. The desk drawers were locked, but locks had never stopped him. He pressed his shoulder against the city's wood until it cracked. The drawer slid open with a groan. There it was. The land deed, Cordelia's lifeline, folded neat among a pile of useless papers. Mountain stared at it, jaw tightening. Rage simmered in his chest, cold and bitter. This wasn't just theft, it was betrayal dressed in a badge. He pulled the paper free and held it to the lamplight. The sheriff's scrawl was on the corner, notes about transfer of claim. Webb hadn't even bothered to hide his intent. He meant to take the widow's land, then pin the crime on the one man the town was already ready to blame. Mountain's fist curled around the parchment until it crumpled. He had seen commanders do the same during the war, using men's lives as pawns, hiding behind orders while others bled. This was no different. Different field, same rot. Behind him, Penny whispered, "I knew it." Her voice shook, but her eyes blazed. "I knew it wasn't you." He looked at her then. This little scrap of a girl standing in the sheriff's den, with fire in her belly. And something inside him shifted. She wasn't just defending him. She was defending the truth in a place where no one else dared. Mountain tucked the deed into his coat. He could have left it at that. Slipped back into the night, handed Cordelia her papers, and ridden out come dawn. But he knew Webb wouldn't let it lie. A man that greedy wouldn't forgive being caught. He'd gather the town against Mountain, twist the story, sharpen their fear into bullets. "Come on," Mountain said, voice low, steady. "We've got what we came for." They stepped out into the cool night. The sky above stretched wide and black. Stars scattered like buckshot across the heavens. The deed felt heavy in his pocket, heavier than iron, heavier than any gun he'd carried. Penny walked beside him, her small hand brushing his coat. For the first time, he wasn't carrying the burden alone. But he knew what morning would bring. The law had shown its face, and it wasn't justice. It was a thief's mask. And when men like Sheriff Webb were cornered, they didn't bargain. They fought. By dawn, the secret was out. Word traveled on the wind, passed from porch to porch until the whole town knew Mountain had the deed, and worse, that he'd pulled it straight from Sheriff Webb's desk. It should have ended there. The truth was plain enough. But fear and greed are stronger than truth, and Webb knew how to stir both. By noon, the sheriff had gathered near every man with a rifle. They filled the street, boots stomping dust into the hot air, their mutters hardening into threats. "He's a thief. He's a killer. He'll bring ruin down on all of us." Webb stood tall in the center, badge glinting, voice raised high. "We can't let a giant brute run this town ragged. He's a danger to our women, to our children. If we don't put him down, who's next?" The men grumbled, and fear did the rest. Guns were lifted, hammers cocked, and the lawless were turned into Webb's soldiers. Mountain watched from the livery porch. Penny huddled close beside him. His revolver rested heavy on his thigh, though he hadn't drawn it. Not yet. The deed was tucked safe in his coat, but he knew paper meant nothing against lead. Penny's hand clutched his sleeve, her knuckles white. "They're gonna come," she whispered. "Yeah," Mountain said, eyes steady on the street. "They'll come." The sky above was darkening, clouds rolling in from the west. The air smelled of rain and powder both, heavy and sharp. The kind of air that makes a man's bones ache with the promise of trouble. "You don't have to fight," Penny said, her voice breaking. "You could run. We could hide." Mountain shook his head, slow and certain. "Running don't change a thing. Men like Webb, they'll keep taking. Somebody's got to stand in their way." Penny's eyes brimmed, but she nodded. She was old enough to understand that some fights came whether you wanted them or not. He bent slightly, laying a scarred hand on her shoulder. "Listen close, little one. When the shooting starts, you stay low. Stay out of sight. No matter what happens, you don't run to me. You hear?" Her lip trembled, but she nodded again. Mountain stood, towering over the porch rail, his long shadow stretching across the dirt. The men in the street shifted, uneasy at the sight of him rising, silent and grim as a storm cloud. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He only watched, eyes cold as steel, waiting for the moment when patience would give way to fire. The town held its breath. Horses stamped nervously. A tumbleweed rolled across the empty space between the sides, catching against a wagon wheel. The world felt balanced on a knife's edge, one spark away from breaking. Mountain adjusted his hat, his revolver loose in his hand now, though not yet raised. Penny pressed against the wall behind him, small and silent, clutching her breath like a prayer. The storm was close. He could feel it in the earth beneath his boots, in the hush that smothered the air. When dawn broke, it would decide them all. The sun hung high and merciless, bleaching the sky until it hurt to look up. Noon. The hour when shadows disappeared, when a man's fate lay bare under God's eye. Mountain stepped down from the livery porch and into the open street. His boots struck the dirt with slow, steady weight, each step sending up a puff of dust that shimmered in the light. He carried no words, only the presence of a man resolved. The revolver hung low at his side, hand loose, as if it had always belonged there. Across from him, Sheriff Webb stood in the center of his gathered men. Rifles gleamed in the sun, barrels aimed, hearts pounding behind them. Webb's sneer stretched wide, hiding the fear in his eyes. He raised his voice loud so all could hear. "There he is, the thief, the brute. You all see it plain. He's got no place among decent folk. Time to end this." The crowd pressed closer, faces tense, children peering through cracks and shutters, women clutching each other's arms. Every soul in town had come to watch. Mountain said nothing. He stopped 10 paces short of the sheriff, his frame towering, dust swirling around him in lacy spirals. The silence was so deep, it seemed the whole world held still. Behind a stack of barrels at the far end of the street, Penny crouched, her eyes wide, breath quick. She pressed her hands together like prayer, though no sound passed her lips. She had faith enough, but faith couldn't stop bullets. For a long heartbeat, nothing moved. Then, from the line of Webb's men, a rifle cracked. The air exploded. Glass shattered from the saloon windows, wood splinters leapt from porch rails, and townsfolk screamed as lead ripped through the street. Dust rose thick, turning the midday sun into a haze of fear and soy. Mountain moved like a man carved from stone, deliberate, unhurried, but unflinching. His revolver roared, one shot, then another, each strike clean and final. A rifleman dropped, then a second. Years of war had honed his aim into something automatic, each motion a memory of battles past. Pain seared across his side as a bullet found flesh. But he didn't falter. His jaw clenched. His legs stayed firm. He pressed forward, step by step, firing steady. The echo of each shot slamming against the walls like a hammer on an anvil. Men shouted, cursed, scrambled for cover, but there was no cover from Mountain's grim precision. The sheriff's line buckled, thinned, then broke. And at last, through the smoke and screams, only Sheriff Webb remained. The lawman's face was pale now, sweat cutting lines through the dust on his skin. His hand shook as he raised his pistol, but the bravado was gone from his voice. "You should have left when you had the chance." Mountain's revolver stayed steady, his breath slow, eyes locked on the man who had tried to turn the town against him. The street held still again, silent but for the hiss of wind through shattered glass. Then one shot rang out, louder than the rest. Sheriff Webb crumpled to the dirt, his badge catching the sun one last time before it lay face down in the dust. The street reeked of gunpowder and fear. Smoke clung low, drifting in gray ribbons that blurred the edges of the world. The echo of gunfire still rattled the windows, though silence had fallen. A silence thick enough to smother breath. Bodies lay scattered across the dirt. Rifles dropped from lifeless hands. Blood darkened the dust in broken patches, soaking into the earth that had already seen too much. Groans came from one or two still breathing, but most were still, faces slack beneath the merciless sun. Mountain stood among them, chest heaving, revolver hanging limp at his side. His shirt clung wet to his ribs where the bullet had torn him. Blood trickled down into his waistband, hot and steady, but he barely seemed to feel it. His eyes swept the street with the same hard calm they had carried into the fight. He had walked through worse before. This was just another battlefield, only smaller, closer, and crueler, because it was home to innocence. He staggered once, caught himself, and kept upright. Each breath cut like a knife, but he refused to bend. A man like him couldn't afford weakness, not here, not now. From the shadows, Penny broke free. She ran to him, darting past the broken rifles, past the bodies, her small arms flung around his waist. She didn't flinch at the blood soaking into her dress. She held him tight, face pressed against his side. Mountain looked down at her, his eyes softening in the haze. For the first time since the war, someone clung to him, not out of fear or anger, but out of faith. The weight of it made his knees almost buckle. All around, townsfolk began to emerge, cautious, slow, their faces pale. Men stepped off porches, women eased open shutters, children peeked from behind skirts. They stared not on the dead, but at the giant standing among them, bloodied yet unbroken, with a child at his side. Shame flickered in their eyes. They had cast him out, named him a thief, a danger, a monster. Yet here he stood, the only man willing to face down their sheriff's greed, the only one who hadn't turned away from truth. Mountain met their gazes, but he didn't speak. He had no words for them, and even if he did, none could cut deeper than the silence already hanging heavy between them. The wind shifted, tugging at his coat, stirring the smoke into fading wisps. Penny's grip tightened, her small hand gripping his scarred one. Mountain closed his fingers around hers, slow and careful, as if the simple act might shatter him more than any bullet. In that moment, he knew. He hadn't fought for himself. He hadn't even fought for the widow's paper deed. He'd fought because one child believed he was worth saving. The street, littered with the price of greed, lay chaos beneath the noon sun. And in the heart of that chaos, Mountain found something rarer than victory. He found a reason. The echo of the last shot seemed to linger forever, but soon even that faded. What remained was the hush of a town too stunned to breathe. The saloon doors swung loose on their hinges, creaking in the wind. A horse whinnied nervously down by the hitching rail, pawing at the ground, sensing the weight of what had just unfolded. Mountain swayed where he stood. His legs trembled beneath him, blood running steady from his side, but his spine stayed straight. He would not fall. Not here. Not now. The revolver slipped from his grip at last, thudding into the dust beside Webb's lifeless body. Penny's small arms wrapped tighter around him, holding fast to the man no one else dared touch. She buried her face against his coat, heedless of the blood soaking through. Mountain looked down at her, his rough hand brushing across her tangled hair. The tenderness in the gesture stood in stark contrast to the carnage around them. The townsfolk crept closer, steps cautious, shame painted plain across their faces. These were the same men and women who had turned their backs, who had spat his name like poison. Now they saw him as he was, broken, bleeding, yet still standing between them and corruption. They couldn't meet his eyes. Some hung their heads, others stared at the ground, as if the dirt itself held the truth they'd refused to see. No one spoke. Words would have sounded hollow in that silence. The widow Cordelia stepped forward at last, her hands trembling as she clutched the recovered deed. She opened her mouth to thank him, but the words died in her throat. Gratitude seemed too small for the cost already paid. Mountain didn't ask for it. He never would. He had learned long ago that thanks was fleeting, but scars lasted. He shifted his gaze across the faces of the crowd. Hard men with rifles lowered, women clutching their children. Their judgment had been swift and merciless, and though the sheriff lay dead at his feet, Mountain knew nothing had truly changed. To them, he was still an outcast, a man marked by violence. This day hadn't washed him clean. It had only proved what they already believed, that death followed him. But to the child at his side, it was different. Penny's trust hadn't faltered, not for once. Her faith had dragged him back into the fight, and her embrace now told him plainly. She saw him not as a monster, but as a man. The giant's shoulders slumped at last, the weight of it all pressing down. Yet in his weariness, there was something new, something gentler than he thought possible. The street lay quiet, the dust settling over bodies, over badges, over rifles dropped, and never to be raised again. The town would remember this day in whispers and half-truths. But Penny would remember it clear, the way a child remembers when the world shows its truest face. And Mountain, he would remember that he hadn't faced it alone. For 2 days, the town lingered in uneasy quiet. No bells rang, no laughter spilled from the saloon. The gun smoke had long since drifted off with the prairie wind, but its memory clung to the streets like a stain that wouldn't wash away. Folks went about their business with hushed voices and quick steps, avoiding the livery, avoiding the place where Sheriff Webb had fallen. Mountain spent those days in shadow, nursing the wound at his side. Cordelia tended him once, slipping in with a basin of water and loincloth, her hands shaking as she pressed against the bleeding. He didn't thank her. Words felt heavy on his tongue. But he met her eyes, and she gave a small nod that said enough. She knew he hadn't fought for glory. He had fought so her home would still be hers come morning. But the rest of the town? They kept their distance. They watched from windows, still afraid, still uncertain. In their silence, Mountainhead heard the truth. No matter what he'd done, he would never belong. Scars ran too deep, his and theirs. Penny stayed close, slipping in and out of his company as though she belonged there. She brought him water, small bits of food, and once a wildflower plucked from the edge of the road. He accepted it all without question. It wasn't in his nature to smile, but in her presence the heaviness in his chest eased, if only a little. Still, he knew it couldn't last. One evening, he saddled his horse under a red horizon. The townsfolk gathered in small knots, whispering, watching. None asked him to stay. None dared wish him safe travels. They simply stared, caught between guilt and relief, knowing the storm was leaving, but unwilling to admit they'd ever wanted it. Cordelia approached with Penny at her side. The widow's face was lined with sorrow, but her eyes carried steel. "She's welcome in my home," Cordelia said, her voice low, but certain. "I'll see she's fed. I'll see she grows." Penny's eyes filled with tears, though she tried to hold them back. She clung to Mountain's coat one last time, her soul gripping the worn fabric, as though she could anchor him here by sheer will. Mountain crouched down, wincing at the pull in his ribs, until his eyes met hers. "You've been strong," he said, voice thick. "Stronger than most grown folk I've ever known. Don't lose that." Her lip trembled, but she nodded. He straightened, swung into the saddle, and turned his horse toward the horizon. The weight in his chest was heavier than the revolver at his side, heavier than the scar across his ribs. It was the weight of leaving something behind he had never asked for, but had come to need. The town let out a breath as he rode. To them, he would always be the outcast. But to one child, he had been more. And that was enough to cut him deeper than any bullet. Morning came with a sky painted in fire. The horizon burned red, streaks of gold breaking through the haze, as if the whole land smoldered from the ashes of yesterday's violence. The town still dozed in silence, shutters closed, streets empty. But one man was already moving. Mountain rode at a steady gait, his frame straight in the saddle, though the wound in his side tugged with every breath. His horse's hooves thudded soft against the dirt, carrying him past the edge of town, past the last hitching post and the last fence line. Behind him, the buildings shrank small and gray, just another place that had never opened its doors to him. He didn't look back. The weight he carried wasn't the saddle or the iron at his hip. It was memory. He carried the hush of the saloon when he first stepped through its doors, the spit of whispers that named him guilty before trial, the cold eyes that followed him, like he was less man and more curse. He carried the smell of powder from the fight, the faces of men he'd cut down, the sheriff's body crumpled in the dirt. But mixed in with that weight, light as a feather, was the memory of a child's hand in his. Penny's eyes, steady and sure, had seen him not as a monster, not as a shadow, but as a man. She had believed when no one else would. And for a little while, she had given him something he thought long buried, a place in this world, however small. He could still hear her voice. "Don't go. He could still feel her grip on his coat. He had left her in Cordelia's care, safe and sheltered. But the leaving tore at him in ways battle never had. The prairie stretched endless before him, rolling waves of grass and dust under the reddened skiwithioi. Out there, no one whispered his name. Out there, no one judged his scars or measured his silence. Out there, a man was just a rider, another shadow on the land. He rode on, steady, the sun climbing higher behind his back. His shadow stretched long across the dirt, a dark figure against the glowing earth. He knew he would never outrun who he was, an outcast marked by war and by violence. But he also knew he carried something new, something harder to kill than any man. He carried redemption, not the kind handed out by townsfolk or preachers, but the kind born in the quiet trust of a child who had nothing to gain by giving it. As the horizon swallowed him, the wind rose, tugging at his coat, carrying the dust of his trail. The west was wedisty, wild and merciless, but it was still big enough for broken men to keep riding. And mountain, scarred and weary, rode on beneath the burning sky.